A C-17 Globemaster clears the runway at Beirut International, its engines screaming against the humid Mediterranean air. Inside are 150 American citizens, a cinematic image of power and protection that will lead every evening news broadcast from New York to Los Angeles. But while that aircraft represents the peak of kinetic reach, it is masking a catastrophic mechanical failure in the bedrock of American influence. Mainstream media is hyper-focused on the dramatic surface, the smoke, the sirens, and the frantic logistics of the evacuation. But for those of us performing an autopsy on the structural foundation, the real explosion didn't happen in the Levant. It happened in a silent, marble-clad courtroom in Washington, D.C. As you've likely noticed through the fog of this crisis, the Supreme Court's recent ruling on executive tariff authority, a direct blow to the administration's reliance on Section 301, has created a geopolitical scissors effect. On one blade, the U.S. can still move mountains of hardware. On the other, it has been legally lobotomized from using its primary economic weapon, the trade levy. This is the quiet failure. We are witnessing a state of strategic inertia where the executive branch is capable of rescuing people, but is institutionally paralyzed from protecting the markets they are returning to. The fracture isn't just about 15,000 evacuees, it's about the unintended mutation of a superpower. We have reached a point where our military capacity to secure a coastline has outpaced our legal capacity to manage the trade routes that make that coastline strategic. The sophisticated insider understands that this isn't a failure of will, it is a failure of the plumbing. We are watching the birth of a new reality, a nation that can project force but can no longer project certainty. The evacuation isn't a victory, it's a high-speed retreat from a financial order breaking in real time. To understand the stakes of this moment, we have to move past the courtroom and look directly at the ledger. The math of reality is far less forgiving than the interpretation of law. The Supreme Court's ruling didn't just end a policy, it created an immediate unfunded liability of $175 billion. For perspective, that is roughly equivalent to the entire annual budget of the Department of Homeland Security, vanishing from the Treasury's projections in a single afternoon. In an environment of tightening M2 money supply and precarious bond yields, the US government cannot simply manifest this liquidity without triggering severe inflationary feedback loops. This is the definition of fiscal fragility, the moment where the administrative state realizes its wallet is as thin as its legal standing. The administration's immediate pivot to Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 is perhaps the most telling example of what happens when a system is forced into an unintended mutation. Section 122 was never intended to be a centerpiece of global trade strategy. It was designed as a balance of payments emergency valve, a relic of an era where currency stability was the primary concern. By invoking it now, the executive branch isn't pursuing a long-term vision of American reindustrialization. Instead, it is performing a desperate liquidity grab to offset the court-ordered refunds. This is the weaponized ledger in its most volatile form, using trade law not to influence foreign capitals, but to balance a domestic checkbook that has suddenly plunged into the red. But here is the structural friction that you, as a sophisticated observer, should be watching. Section 122 is a 150-day temporary measure. It is a financial tourniquet applied to a severed artery. It buys the administration time, but it does nothing to heal the underlying wound. The incentive failure here is systemic. By bypassing the constitutional power of the purse, the executive has forced itself into a cycle of emergency governance. They are now reliant on increasingly obscure and temporary legal loopholes to keep the gears of the economy turning, which in turn creates a vacuum of predictability. Capital, by its very nature, hates a vacuum. When global investors look at the US trade posture today, they no longer see a coherent, multi-decade strategy. They see a series of 150-day patches. As these 15% emergency tariffs take hold, they trigger what we might call a circular theft. The government is effectively taxing the American consumer to pay back the American corporation for a tax that was declared illegal in the first place. It is a redistribution of capital that serves no strategic purpose other than the preservation of the ledger itself. The system isn't breaking because of a single political error. It is operating exactly as a fragmented institution must when its primary tools of leverage have been stripped away. It is cannibalizing its own long-term economic stability for short-term fiscal survival. This is the mathematical reality of a superpower in a state of kernel panic. If we move our gaze from the domestic ledger to the global map, we begin to see the true cost of this institutional friction. In the geography of the 21st century, position is destiny, and the American position is currently undergoing a violent recalibration. The Beirut whirlwind, the urgent, hollowed-out evacuation of the US Embassy, is not a localized regional crisis. It is the physical manifestation of geopolitical inertia, a superpower in retreat because its primary tool of global management, the threat of financial exclusion, has lost its edge. For decades, the United States maintained order not just through carrier groups, but through the credible threat of disconnecting adversaries from the dollar clearing system. This was the ultimate geopolitical decree. But as you've likely observed through the rising volumes in non-dollar settlements among BRICS plus nations, that lever has snapped. The internal tariff war in Washington has signaled to the world that the American captain is too distracted by legal insurgencies at home to sustain a coherent deterrent abroad. Iran and its regional proxies are not operating in a vacuum. They are sensing a vacuum of American resolve and moving to fill it before the 150-day window of Section 122 expires. While Washington fights over whether a tariff is a tax or an emergency measure, the rest of the world is engaged in a cold, opportunistic rerouting. The European Union and China are not watching the Supreme Court's 6-3 ruling with glee. They are watching with a calculated fear that has accelerated their own strategic decoupling. Geography dictates that if the US raises a 15% wall, the water of global trade will simply find a lower path. We are seeing the rapid expansion of the Middle Corridor and the tightening of the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, systems designed specifically to function without the permission of the US Treasury. The tragic irony here is that the administration's attempt to de-risk from foreign adversaries has resulted in those adversaries de-risking from the United States. This is the incentive failure of unilateralism. By weaponizing the ledger so unpredictably, Washington has incentivized the world to build a parallel architecture where American court rulings and executive orders are increasingly irrelevant. The Beirut evacuation is the sound of the gravitational pull of the dollar weakening. When you can no longer command the ledger, you can no longer command the map. The world is transitioning from a rules-based order to a state of tactical adaptation, where geography and physical supply chains trump executive decrees. While the national discourse remains fixated on the high-level friction between the executive and the judiciary, the forensic audit of this policy is being tallied in real time on the American kitchen table. We are often told that these maneuvers are part of a national sacrifice for long-term sovereignty, but if we look at the raw data, we see a much more cynical reality. The American consumer is not a participant in this constitutional experiment. They are its involuntary creditor, forced to settle an account they never agreed to open. The core issue here isn't just the sticker price of imported goods, it's the cost of capital and the skyrocketing risk premium being baked into the domestic economy. As the administration and the court battle over the legality of Section 122, American businesses are forced to operate in a state of permanent legal ambiguity. When a corporation cannot predict its tax liability 150 days from now, it doesn't lower prices, it builds a protection buffer into its margins. This is the birth of the ghost tax. If you look at the Personal Consumption Expenditures PCE index, specifically for intermediate goods, the impact of the 15% emergency tariff is devastating. These aren't just finished products, they are the aluminum, the semiconductors, and the chemicals that fuel American manufacturing. The 15% levy acts as a compounding tax that ripples through the supply chain before it ever reaches the retail shelf. By the time a consumer buys a refrigerator or a new vehicle, that 15% has mutated into a 25% price hike. This is where the incentive failure becomes most acute. The $175 billion refund mandated by the Supreme Court, money that was supposed to correct the previous illegal overreach, will never actually reach the public. As a sophisticated observer, you can see the shell game. That capital will remain trapped on corporate balance sheets to offset the new 15% emergency tax. The government is effectively taking from the consumer's right pocket to pay back the corporate left pocket, all while the state maintains its grip on the total pool of liquidity. It is a circular theft. The administration is using the American middle class as a high-interest credit line to fund its constitutional standoff. We are told this is about protecting American jobs, but the data suggests we are merely increasing the cost of the tools those workers need to compete. The system isn't breaking because of a single policy error. It is operating as a predatory mechanism designed to preserve the state's fiscal survival at the expense of domestic purchasing power. The forensic audit of the average household budget proves that in a war between the branches of government, it is the citizen who pays the indemnity. As we finalize this forensic audit of the American trade posture, we must confront a question that the headlines carefully ignore. Can a superpower sustain its gravitational pull when its internal operating system is in a state of permanent kernel panic? We aren't just looking at a policy disagreement, we are witnessing the systemic arrhythmia of a republic that has forgotten how to function within its own boundaries. The conflict between the executive and the judiciary isn't a sign of a healthy democracy checking itself, it is the sound of the gears of state finally grinding each other into dust. We have moved beyond the era of policy debate and entered an era of legal insurgency. The president is using 50-year-old emergency valves to bypass 200-year-old constitutional principles, effectively creating a post-legal environment where the rule of law is secondary to the immediate survival of the ledger. When the executive branch decides that it is easier to bypass the Constitution than to work with it, the very foundation of American predictability dissolves. The Beirut whirlwind, the urgent, hollowed-out evacuation of our diplomatic presence, is the physical price of this internal rot. For decades, American deterrence wasn't built on missiles. It was built on the dollar's role as the world's undisputed ledger. But as Washington weaponizes that ledger so unpredictably against its own people and the world, that deterrent has snapped. The ghost in the machine is the realization that the primary engine of American stability, the absolute certainty that our laws mean what they say, has been declared a constitutional overreach by our own highest authority. We are transitioning from a world of rules-based certainty to a state of tactical adaptation, a chaotic landscape where geography and physical supply chains trump executive decrees. The pain here isn't just in the $175 billion refund or the 15% price hike at the grocery store. The real pain lies in the irreversible loss of institutional trust. When global investors and regional powers look at Washington today, they no longer see a reliable captain. They see a navigator and a skipper wrestling for control of a ship that is already taking on water. The forensic audit is clear. You can print more money and you can sign new emergency decrees, but you cannot manifest the trust that has been liquidated in this standoff. We didn't lose our lead to a foreign rival, we lost it to our own strategic inertia. The machine is still humming, but the ghost has already left the room. Tonight's State of the Union will not be a victory lap. It will be a tactical counterstrike against the strategic inertia currently paralyzing the American judiciary. Expect the president to frame the Supreme Court's tariff restrictions not as a legal debate, but as a sabotage of national sovereignty. He will likely use the burning skyline of Beirut as the ultimate visual justification for a national economic emergency, arguing that in a world of high-velocity conflict, the executive branch cannot be tethered by the slow-moving gears of the court system. For the sophisticated observer, the focus won't be on the rhetoric, but on the incentive realignment. The president is expected to announce a formal Levantine exclusion zone, effectively weaponizing the Beirut evacuation to implement a permanent economic blockade against Iranian proxies. This is the weaponized ledger in its most aggressive form, cutting off the dollar liquidity switchboard of the Mediterranean under the guise of crisis management. On the domestic front, keep a close watch on the 10-year Treasury yield. If the president signals a direct challenge to the court's authority tonight, we anticipate a sharp spike in volatility. The bond market is already sniffing out the fiscal fragility of a government that is attempting to subsidize a trade war while its supply lines are in a state of unintended mutation. If yields break the 4.9% Rubicon, the tariff shield will begin to crack under the sheer weight of sovereign debt servicing costs. The individual isn't the story tonight, the institutional collision is. The president isn't just speaking to Congress, he is attempting to rewrite the laws of economic gravity to preserve a system that is rapidly outgrowing its own legal architecture. History isn't written by the headlines, it's written by those who understand the mechanics beneath them. Subscribe to keep decoding the layers of the machine.